How do you recruit and retain great staff? What does great culture look like? How do you have difficult conversations? The Supporting Leaders podcast connects with leaders in the field to gain insights into these leadership challenges and beyond. Enjoy the show. So if you have been following along and listening to the episodes on the Supporting Leaders podcast, this one is completely unique to all of the other episodes. Kelsey Tyrrell talks to us about the World Food Prize Foundation. And I, knew a little bit about the World Food Prize Foundation, but it was so interesting to hear more about what they're doing, and specifically talking about the Youth Institute and how they get youth involved, and Kelsey's take on getting youth voices to the table. It really inspired me to think more about how we are doing that in a multitude of organizations. So this podcast really is for any leader. I know for sure people in education and for sure people who work with young people are going to be interested, but I would really encourage people even outside of that realm to take a listen, because I think that this is so applicable to other areas. So let me tell you a little bit more about Kelsey. Kelsey is the Director of Youth Leadership Development, and she is responsible for planning and coordination of the World Food Prize Global Youth Institute, as well as expanding strategic partnerships with schools, nonprofits, and key stakeholders at the state, national, and international level to inspire the next generation of young leaders to end hunger and poverty. In addition to her role with GYI, Kelsey directs the Iowa Youth Institute, which annually attracts over 500 Iowa high school students and teachers to a day-long program at Iowa State where students engage with leading experts on key issues affecting our global food system. Kelsey also has extensive experience working with high school youth in career-based mentoring programs with an emphasis in the fields of science, technology, engineering, and math, or STEM, as some of you might know it. She served for 2 years as a representative on the Iowa Mentoring Partnership Advisory Council, and has also been involved with local and statewide initiatives to combat human trafficking in Iowa. I think you guys are really going to enjoy this episode, so take a listen. On today's episode of Supporting Leaders, I have with us Kelsey Tyrrell, and she is the Director of Youth Leadership Development at the World Food Prize. And Kelsey, this is such a unique position and title. And so, I've been following you on LinkedIn and seeing some of the things you post, and I reached out and I'm like, oh my God, you would be such a fun person to interview. So thank you so much for being part of the show today.
Yeah, happy to be here. I am really excited about what I get to do every day. I've been working in youth development for the last 10 years, but I've been at the World Food Prize for about 4 of those years. And what we do is really unique and exciting. So excited to dig in.
So tell us, for those who don't know, I think a lot of people in Iowa, and especially those who might be listening who are educators, are probably familiar with the World Food Prize. But those who are not familiar, give us a little background on what that is.
Sure. So the World Food Prize Foundation is headquartered in Des Moines, but we actually work with schools across the U.S., and we actually have some partnerships also outside the U.S. We were founded by Dr. Norman Borlaug, a native of Cresco, Iowa. He won the Nobel Peace Prize for developing a hybrid form of wheat that grows in almost any weather condition, thus leading him to win the Nobel Peace Prize in 1970, because this newly genetically modified wheat actually ended up saving over 1 billion lives across the globe. And so when he won the Nobel Peace Prize, he started the World Food Prize Foundation with his winnings, because he was actually the first person to win the Peace Prize and working in agriculture.
Wow.
And so it was actually, even though it was 1970, you'd think that at least someone in that space would have won it from agriculture. But one of my favorite quotes that fits kind of his mindset perfectly is, you cannot build a peaceful world on empty stomachs and human misery. And so naturally, you have to have food as that component of meeting those basic needs in order for humans to thrive. And another element of his mission was to actually get young people excited about working in agriculture and kind of break down those myths about what it means to be a global change maker, and what kind of careers you can pursue, no matter if you go into engineering, into agronomy, into policy, into journalism. You can be part of feeding the world no matter what your passion is.
Wow, I had no idea that backstory. That is pretty cool. And, I would think it'd be pretty easy to support that mission and go to work every day if that's, what you're working toward.
Right.
So the youth component of this and the youth education. So what are the opportunities for youth with the World Food Prize?
Right. So we are heavily ingrained into Iowa with the Iowa Youth Institute that we host every April. But what makes us truly unique is the model we use for our Iowa Youth Institute, and I'll explain that in a bit. We've actually replicated that Youth Institute model in 22 other US states and 3 other countries so far. We're still building. We actually have youth institutes in the Netherlands, in Sweden, and Honduras. But that Youth Institute model is a way for students to have a seat at the table. So we want students to pick a topic affecting our food system and propose a solution to improve the lives of families living within a particular country. We actually require them to write about a different country other than their own because we want students to gain a global perspective. So even though there's issues with food security here in the US, we know that if they have this better awareness of issues around the world, it actually makes them more informed about issues here at home, and gives them a bigger picture of what it means to support one another no matter what career you go into. And so students write a paper to share their ideas for combating complex issues like nutrition, health, also maybe infrastructure, and building better roads and bridges to gain access to better food markets. And so students use that paper as their ticket to get into our Youth Institute. And then they present their idea in what we call a roundtable. And that roundtable is very key because it's not a PowerPoint presentation where you stand up and sit down and then you're done. This roundtable is a mix of peers of their own age, but also experts who work in a lot of different fields. So our model partners with universities across the US. So we bring in faculty from Iowa State, in particular in Iowa, for them to give feedback to the students on their solution. We also invite nonprofit leaders, we invite industry experts to give students feedback, and it becomes a conversation about well, have you thought about it from this perspective? Or I did this research as a grad student at Iowa State, and here's what I know about that. But students are actually a part of that conversation. At the World Food Prize, we actually view youth and adults on the same playing field. We don't see, adults on one level and students down here, but it's really on an equal footing because our students are bringing a unique perspective to some of our world's biggest challenges. And I think we've seen that over the last year, and in terms of the youth that are speaking up who are no longer wanting to sit on the sidelines. So we've been really excited to, our programs have been around, for 30 years now, but it's really exciting to see the youth actually get that voice publicly. And so we're hoping to be part of more of that public awareness that youth have been here the whole time. We just haven't really given them a seat at the table. And so that's what we're about, is giving those young leaders a seat at the table.
What a fantastic opportunity for students and young voices. Do you have like a story you can share of like maybe somebody who came and presented and then it like took off, or maybe they're like doing something with that to this day?
Yeah, I have so many stories, but I'll share one in particular. So we just started our Honduras Youth Institute 2 years ago, and the teacher that brought her students to Des Moines for our Global Youth Institute, that is kind of a culmination of all of our regional youth institutes. We select a handful of students to participate in our international conference we hold every fall in Des Moines. And one of our teachers brought 3 students from Honduras because they were actually able to present their ideas to very well-known researchers. We actually have what we call World Food Prize laureates who win a $250,000 prize from us every year for their work to improve the quality and quantity and availability of food in the world. One of those laureates actually spent some time with one of our students after a roundtable discussion on incorporating sweet potatoes into the diets of Honduran families, because sweet potatoes aren't regularly grown in Honduras, but they have a lot of vitamins and nutrients that we all need to develop healthy and active brains, healthy and active bodies. So long story short, because of that interaction with one of our World Food Prize laureates, that laureate, her name is Jan Lowe, is actually working with the teacher and the students in Honduras to actually get sweet potatoes to be grown in Honduras now, a crop that they never would have thought of growing there. But Jan Lowe has adapted the variety of sweet potato to be grown in a climate like Honduras. But because of an idea that was sparked at the Global Youth Institute, those students are actually now getting exposure from an incredible mentor and also going alongside her. And that, I think that's a key part of what we do. Our youth are walking alongside some of the greatest minds in our country and our world. They're not just this token seat where they don't have a voice, but we're bringing them along with them, because we know if we want these issues to be solved, to be addressed, it's going to be this generation that's going to have to know how to fix it. So it's definitely not lip service at the World Food Prize.
That is the coolest story. I'm like sitting here like getting goosebumps as you're telling that story. And then I think about, you know, when this foundation was formed, just the continued ripple effect of change and impact that it's had. So I want to turn to your title specifically, this Director of Youth Leadership Development. I think that's such an interesting title. So tell us a little bit more about what does that title mean and how do you help develop youth or youth leadership?
Sure. Yes. So we about 2 years ago, we went through a little bit of strategic planning, a little bit of realignment to really think about how we train and support young people, but it was very siloed. We've had our programs in existence for about 30 years, but changing my title to Director of Youth Leadership Development meant that we were actually going to more intentionally weave youth into all of our programs, not just the youth programs. So you might see programs like 4-H or FFA, which are fantastic youth leadership development programs, but they're youth specific. What we do at the World Food Prize is we have programs for adults. We host the International Borlaug Dialogue every fall. We have this World Food Prize award that we give out every year. So we are a foundation that's thinking about solving big challenges from a multi-generational lens. So it's not just youth over here in their organization and adults over here in their organization. They're ingrained in everything that we do. And actually a really great example of this was last fall when we had to do our event virtually. Students were actually presenting their ideas in their roundtables, and we took notes from their roundtables, and we're actually in the process of developing a white paper that is now going to be shared with United Nations for the UN Food System Summit this fall. And so again, we're a little bit different in that way, in that it's not just this thing that happens at the end of an event or happens in an echo chamber. The students' ideas are being put on an international stage. And so it's not just about our youth institutes, but it's about where else can we elevate their voice, whether that be at the UN or maybe in their community, and recommending them for an award or recommending them for a board position in their communities. So it's a great model that I'm really excited to be a part of, but we're definitely interwoven and not just standing outside of all the other great things that are happening. We're weaving them into the fabric of the solutions.
That makes sense. And I think too, being with the background in education in Iowa, I think a lot of when I think of the World Food Prize, I think of really it's the Youth Institute, and so it's nice to hear you talk about all that there is that the World Food Prize Foundation does, but then additionally, all of the ways that you integrate youth voice and participation. So you talked about how you for like 10 years, you've worked with youth and youth leadership. I'm interested to know, have you seen a change in youth leadership or a change in what they're passionate about, or what have you noticed in 10 years?
Yeah, I think a lot has changed in the last 10 years. But I'll be honest with you, I don't know necessarily that youth have changed or the things that they want have changed. I think adults have changed, and we've seen youth in a new light, especially in the last 2 to 3 years. Youth have always been eager to be a part of the conversation. I learned that early on when I ran a mentoring program for an organization here in Des Moines, that they already have the ideas. They just need the platform and the adult to bring them to the table. So it's not necessarily about me being the face of our programs. It's about the youth being the face and the voice of our programs. So I would say I think it's just more of adults have finally come around to listening to their ideas more clearly, more urgently. Because we know that, especially within the last couple of years, that youth have really come up with a lot of the great ideas, have been the ones pushing the policy changes to make our world a more equitable place. But I think it's also been because adults have realized they have a perspective we don't have. I've been working in youth development for the last 10 years, and we can bring all these great ideas to the table, but what are those ways that we can bring their idea to the table as well? Because it's diverse as well. And I think it's a really exciting time to be in youth development because they're finally getting the voice that they deserve, and we need to keep pushing that.
It's so exciting to me that there's so many young people who do want to have their voice heard and are looking for these opportunities. I think back to like when I was maybe in high school, and I think it's so natural sometimes to just be like focused on yourself or focused on your own little world. And
Right.
So, from your perspective, like what's the difference between like a teenager who, maybe even that's like developmentally appropriate that you're like focused in on yourself, right? To like the youth who does understand this like global economy and the impact, like what's the difference between those two teenagers? Why might one see the world in a bigger context than the other?
Mm-hmm. I think it just comes down to exposure. A lot of our students come to our youth institutes with an idea, and then they walk away feeling almost surprised that an adult was listening to them and was taking their ideas seriously. And then it just feeds into wanting more of that exposure, not necessarily like an internship, but more of like a conversation with an adult of, hey, here's this research that I found, or hey, here's a program that's happening in your community. Will you actually, we want to have a youth representative on our board. The students maybe don't realize what's possible until they've been exposed to it. Of course, we want to bring these concepts and these topics about ways to address food security and age appropriate ways for sure, but that doesn't mean that they should be left out of the conversation. Make sure that those board meetings you're a part of are just age appropriate, not to say that they don't have a voice. I think we just need to restructure how we bring those voices in, and not make sure that they're separate or that they get to be at the meeting on the Zoom call or in their room, but they're not integrated into the choices that are being made. So it's they just need that exposure to get that confidence. And I think that's another thing we do really well, is boosting students' confidence to pursue really interesting careers. And I'm not even saying interesting careers outside of the state, but giving them opportunities to see themselves in the positions that they hope to pursue. So I think exposure is really key.
Yeah, I think that that's really interesting advice. And I was going to tap into that a little bit more. You know, as you're talking, I keep thinking about all of the different opportunities, whether it's an organization or if you're in a school or wherever you're at, but just the different opportunities places have to integrate voice and integrate youth leadership. So if somebody's listening and they're interested in and inspired by this to do some of that work, what advice might you have to that person as they begin to find opportunities to incorporate youth leadership?
Yeah, I know that a number of different bigger companies and maybe even school districts are bringing youth on as a youth representative. But what I would challenge those organizations or those school districts or whatever organization you work at, to build them into the fold of actually having them asking them to come to the table with ideas, not necessarily letting them present once a year on a topic that they care about, but having them be a key decision maker on your team. So it just has to be consistent and not just you're on our board and you have maybe voting power, but maybe there's not a chance for you to speak up because there's a lot of big words being said or terminology that you might not understand. That's not on the student, that's on the adults to define those things for them. So even if you feel like it might be over their heads, it'll only take an extra 5 minutes to explain those terms to the student, and then they're more engaged in the conversation. So challenging organizations that not only work with youth, but maybe you work for a John Deere plant in Waterloo, or maybe you work for a small grocery store or company in your local community. If you just take that 5 minutes to explain some of those terms before the meeting, they're going to have that confidence to want to have that voice and opinion and not feel like they are maybe tokenized. My other recommendation would be, if you're planning on inviting youth to serve in some leadership capacity, invite 2 at a time. Don't just invite one youth to serve on your board or whatever position it might be, because they might feel overwhelmed or intimidated. But if they have someone to lean on that's maybe the same age or same perspective, they might feel that support and confidence to speak up because they have another person to back up their opinion and amplify that voice. So I've learned over time that that's a key best practice to bringing youth into the conversation, is bring 2 or 3 in together, because they'll feel more confident about themselves knowing someone's behind them to back them up.
That's fantastic advice. And what I hear you saying is really about how to empower them, not just bringing them to the table to, okay, check it off the list. I've got youth voice, but really, like, what's the intent and purpose? It's to empower this individual. So how do we empower youth? And so I want to end with this question, Kelsey, and I think I know the answer, but I am looking forward to your response. But why is it so important for us to develop our youth leaders? Why is it so important for us to have youth voices be heard?
Yeah, we could talk about that all afternoon. I'm going to lean on another quote from Norman Borlaug. And when he started our youth programs way back when, he had said, if you want students to solve these issues when they're 50 and 60 years old and in their prime of their working age, we have to get them exposed when they're 15 and 16. If you think about the careers that you're in today, what were those early exposures that you had as a young person? And we're not going to be able to solve big issues in food security or whatever issue it might be if the students don't have the exposure to those opportunities. And I strongly believe you can't be what you can't see. And so if we're also bringing in adults with diverse perspectives, so students can see themselves in those positions, that people who look like them and have similar perspectives, that gives students that confidence to not only, once that exposure to them has been made, it gives them that boost to go into that position because they see themselves working in whatever field it might be.
Love that. I love it.
I could talk all afternoon, but I'm going to end with that.
Well, it's a perfect way to end because it's inspiring. And I hope other people walk away from this, not just with a better understanding of the World Food Prize Foundation, but just the importance of that youth leadership and having their voices be heard. So Kelsey, thank you so much for sharing your passion. And, as somebody else who's very passionate about youth and about youth leadership, I appreciate all that you do. I can tell that you're so passionate for it, and you seem to be in the right spot to support them. So I appreciate all you do, and thank you so much for being on the show.
Here you'll find links to the YouTube versions of our interviews and links to the podcast. You'll also find articles on leadership. To join in on the conversation, find the Supporting Leaders group on Facebook and find us on Instagram at Supporting Leaders.